Right before I walked down the aisle, my father texted me one word: disgraceful. But when the chapel doors opened, 200 Navy SEALs stood and saluted. "Admiral on deck." "I'm Rachel, a Navy officer, and that was my wedding day. Ever had someone try to dim your proudest moment? Tell me, how would you have reacted?" The chapel doors stood only a few feet ahead, their polished oak surface reflecting the filtered glow of stained glass. My bouquet felt heavier than it should have, maybe because my hands were already tense. I had imagined this moment would be simple. Me, a breath away from walking down the aisle, nerves humming in the background, Michael's face waiting for me. Instead, my phone buzzed in my palm, and I made the mistake of glancing down. Disgraceful. 2 words, nothing more. Yet they sliced cleaner than any salute my father had ever withheld. I could almost hear the clipped cadence in his voice, the kind he used to dress down junior officers in the Army. A part of me wanted to set the phone aside, pretend I hadn't seen it, but the truth settled like a stone in my chest. On the day meant to be about love and new beginnings, my father still found room for judgment. Chief Daniel Brooks shifted beside me, his frame solid in dress whites. "You okay, Admiral?" His tone carried the respectful formality of the Navy, but his eyes searched mine like a friend's. I managed a small nod. "Ready as I'll ever be." My voice didn't quite match the words. Senior Chief Luis Alvarez adjusted his white gloves, catching my glance with a quick, reassuring smile. The faint scent of starch and salt air clung to both of them, a mixture of their uniforms and the breeze sneaking in from the bay. Through the narrow gap where the double doors met, I could see a fragment of the chapel interior. Sunlight spilling across the aisle, a sea of white covers lined in perfect symmetry. Michael stood at the altar, his navy blue suit sharp but understated, hands loosely clasped in front of him. Even at this distance, I could sense his steadiness, like an anchor holding firm in any tide. The organist's prelude softened into a pause, and the air shifted. A petty officer's voice rang out clear and strong from somewhere inside. "Admiral on board!" It was an old Navy tradition, rarely heard in a chapel, and the sound jolted something deep inside me. The double doors swung open, flooding my eyes with light and form. 200 sailors rose as one, the creak of wooden pews perfectly synchronized, the glint of polished brass buttons catching the morning sun. The quiet reverence of the moment was broken only by the rustle of uniforms, the subtle tap of shoes aligning. My heels clicked against the stone floor as I stepped forward, Brooks on my left, Alvarez on my right. Every stride carried the weight of years. The long deployments, the missed holidays, the relentless push to prove myself in a world still skeptical of women in command. And here they were, every one of them, honoring not just my rank, but my life. The stained glass windows along the aisle painted shifting colors across my dress, blues like the deep Atlantic, reds like sunset over the pier. Somewhere beyond the colored light, the dogwoods were in bloom, their white petals trembling in the breeze. The azaleas flared in shades of pink and coral against the chapel's brick walls. I tried to keep my gaze forward, but my eyes flickered across familiar faces in the pews. Crewmates from past commands, mentors who'd guided me, even a few who'd once doubted me but had come anyway. Michael's eyes met mine halfway down the aisle. They didn't waver, not even when my own threatened to. His mouth curved in the smallest smile, the kind meant just for me. I didn't see my father. Not in the front rows, not in the shadows of the balcony, not standing by the door like some latecomer. The empty space where I might have expected him was just that, empty. Still, as I reached the front, Brooks and Alvarez peeled away with crisp precision, and I took my place beside Michael. The minister began to speak, his voice warm but formal, yet my mind drifted for a heartbeat to the message still in my phone. It didn't belong here, not in this sacred hush filled with sunlight and salt air. I inhaled, letting the scent of polished wood and blooming azaleas push it from my mind. When the congregation bowed for the opening prayer, I felt the weight of 200 salutes behind me. This wasn't pity, and it wasn't obligation. It was respect, hard-earned and freely given. My father might have withheld his, but standing in that chapel, I realized I didn't need it to feel whole. Still, as we turned toward each other for the vows, a quiet thought lodged in the back of my mind. If he wasn't inside, where was he? I didn't spot my father inside that day, but someone else had seen where he was. I was born into the military, not by signing enlistment papers, but by inheritance. Our house, tucked into a quiet cul-de-sac not far from Fort Belvoir, had the crispness of a base inspection. Boots stood in pairs, angled at 45 degrees near the front closet. Metals shone behind glass, each with a tiny typed label. Even the air carried a certain discipline: lemon polish on wood furniture, faint starch from my father's uniforms, the sterile tang of a home where every corner was accounted for. Dinner was at 1800 hours sharp, no matter what. My father sat at the head of the table, posture like a blueprint, sleeves rolled with perfect symmetry. Conversation was minimal, my mother asking polite questions, me answering in short sentences. If my fork scraped too loudly against the plate, he'd glance up without a word and I'd feel the heat in my cheeks. Sundays ended in the living room, the television tuned to 60 minutes, the clock ticking softly between segments. Those evenings were silent except for the voices coming from the screen. I learned early how to fill silence with my own thoughts. The Army-Navy game was practically a holiday in our house, but not in a warm way. One December afternoon, I sat cross-legged on the carpet in a Navy sweatshirt a friend had given me, mostly for the fun of it. My father, standing behind the couch, folded his arms when he saw me. "You'll never wear those colors," he said, his voice flat. I tried to smile like it was a joke, but the look in his eyes told me it wasn't. My mother softened those edges where she could. At bedtime, when I was younger, she'd sit on the edge of my bed with a book of Emily Dickinson poems. Her voice would dip and rise like she was speaking directly to me, not just reading words from a page. "You're my storm bird," she'd say after closing the book, brushing a strand of hair from my forehead. "You don't wait for calm seas." I didn't always understand the poems, but I understood the way her voice wrapped around me like a quilt. By high school, I kept most of my world outside the house. My friends and I met at the track before first period, lingered in the art room during lunch. Prom night came in a whirl of sequins and borrowed shoes. I went with a group instead of a date. Our limousine swapped for a classmate's dented SUV. After the dance, we ended up at a local diner with Formica tables and a jukebox that hadn't worked in years. The smell of sizzling burgers mixed with the sweet malt of milkshakes, the vinyl seats sticky from years of wear. I can still feel the warmth of the mug in my hands, the coffee not much better than cafeteria brew, but perfect for that hour. We laughed until my cheeks hurt, safe in a corner booth far from any inspections. When I told my father I was applying to the Naval Academy, he didn't respond. Not in anger, not in approval. Just silence, the kind that stretched over days, then weeks. That silence lasted almost a year. My mother filled the gap where she could, asking about my essays, folding my application packet with careful precision, as though willing it to succeed. Then she got sick. The kind of sick that turns hospital corridors into familiar hallways and makes the beeping of monitors a background song. She never complained, though sometimes I caught her staring out the window as if measuring the distance to the clouds. On one of those days when her voice was thin but still hers, she reached for my hand. "Keep flying," she whispered. I nodded, even as my throat closed. She was gone before the letter came. The envelope from Annapolis arrived on a damp March afternoon, the sky low and heavy. I stood in the kitchen alone, the tile cool under my bare feet. The paper felt thick, official. I tore it open and read the words I'd been chasing for years. "We are pleased to offer you an appointment to the United States Naval Academy." I didn't shout. I didn't call anyone. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table where we'd eaten 100 1800-hour dinners, the lemon polish smell still faint in the air. My father was at his study desk upstairs, the door closed. I didn't go to him. I poured myself a glass of water, set the letter neatly in front of me, and let the knowledge settle in. That night, I ordered takeout from the diner, burgers and fries, and ate at the table alone, the sound of the paper bag crinkling in the quiet. I raised my glass like a toast, not to anyone in the room, but to myself. I learned to salute myself when no one else would. They said I wouldn't last a year. I stayed for 5. My first assignment dropped me straight into the logistics office of a forward deployed command in Okinawa. The summers were heavy there, the air so wet it seemed to cling to your skin before the day even started. Every morning, the bugle call broke the thin thread of sleep I managed, and by 05:30, we were already in formation for PT. The asphalt under my sneakers radiated the previous day's heat, even in dawn's gray light. The crew was almost entirely male, and most had already decided who I was before I said a word. Some version of, the admiral's daughter playing sailor, or she won't last through her first monsoon season. I learned quickly that proving them wrong didn't come with speeches. It came with showing up on time, sweating alongside them, and getting the job done without fuss. In the logistics bay, the air smelled faintly of diesel and paper. Crates marked for shipment stacked like puzzle pieces, clipboards with grease marks along the edges. My job was to track every moving part of our supply chain, from replacement engine valves to coffee filters for the mess hall. The mess hall was its own world. Metal trays clattering, powdered eggs sliding next to hash browns, and the low hum of conversations about weekend plans or the latest ship gossip. On Saturdays, if the weather held, someone always pulled a grill onto the pier, and we'd eat ribs with sauce that dripped onto our sleeves, the smell mixing with salt air. By the end of my second year, I'd rotated through 3 billets and found myself deployed with a joint task force off the coast of Somalia. It was meant to be a routine escort mission. Watch the shipping lanes, keep the waters safe. That changed in seconds when the radio crackled with reports of incoming fire near one of our small boats. We moved fast, training taking over before thought. I still remember the heat of the deck under my knees, the sound of gunfire in the distance, and the acrid sting of smoke in the wind. One of our sailors had been hit, shrapnel tearing into his leg. His face was pale, lips pressed tight against pain. I clamped the tourniquet, shouting over the roar of the engines for more gauze, my voice steady though my pulse pounded. We hauled him back aboard, the medics taking over in a blur. Later they told me my hands had been cold the whole time, like ice. That's when the nickname started, Iceback, meant as a joke at first, then as something else, a reminder that I didn't break under pressure. Back stateside, I took orders for Coronado, California. Winters there were brisk but clear, the ocean air cutting through the morning like fresh linen. Coronado wasn't just about beaches. It was a crucible for some of the Navy's toughest training programs. I'd seen too many injuries sap good sailors from the ranks, so I pushed for changes. Adjusted conditioning schedules, better hydration protocols, actual rest days built into the cycle. It wasn't glamorous work, but 6 months in, the numbers spoke. Injuries were down, dropout rates cut nearly in half. Chief Daniel Brooks, then just a first-class petty officer, liked to rib me about turning into the Navy's den mother. But I saw the pride in his grin when a trainee who might have washed out crossed the finish line instead. We weren't saving the world, but we were saving futures. Promotion came on a windy March morning, the Pacific glittering just beyond the parade ground. My dress whites felt heavier than usual, the new bars catching the sun as the orders were read aloud. Rear Admiral, youngest in my command. The applause rolled over me like surf. And for a moment, I let myself believe my father might finally see what I'd built. That night, in my small on-base quarters, I set my cover on the table and took a photo. Bars gleaming, my face caught between exhaustion and pride. I sent it to him with a simple message. Thought you'd want to know. The reply came faster than the mail. It was silence. They rose for me in perfect unison. He stood alone, under a tree. The call, Admiral on board, rang like struck brass. The doors opened and light slid across pews and dress whites as 200 sailors stood in one breath. Benches sighed, fabric whispered, and then the kind of silence fell that says, "We're here for something that matters." I stepped forward between Chief Brooks and Senior Chief Alvarez. Their sleeves brushed mine, steadying without holding. The aisle runner softened my steps into a small, reliable drumbeat. Stained glass washed the floor in bands of rose and cobalt. For a moment I walked through color, as if through water. Michael waited at the altar in a Navy suit, shoulders relaxed, eyes calm. I used to think joy would make me tremble. Instead, it made me precise. I felt the weight of my ribbons, the smooth line of the collar, the mild ache where bouquet stems pressed into my palm. The chapel smelled of lilies and lemon oil and a hint of salt from the bay. I did not return a salute. This wasn't a deck. But I gave a nod that meant thank you. Faces surfaced from the rows, shipmates from early billets, mentors who argued with me at 0600 and defended me by noon. A junior officer who once said my voice over the speakers felt like shoreline. Their eyes didn't glitter. They held. At the chancel, Brooks and Alvarez peeled away with the crispness of men who know their cue. Michael took my hands. His were warm, steadier than the sunlight pouring through glass. The chaplain's words rose and fell like tide. Promise, blessing, the ordinary miracle of standing still and meaning it. My father reached me in the prayer, as he often did, in the quiet. 2 words in my phone had tried to puncture the day. I let them drift toward the edge of my mind like a dull boat on an outgoing tide. We said vows we'd written at the kitchen table. Simple, mostly about time, how to make room for rest, for courage, for each other's work. Michael's voice caught once and smoothed. Mine didn't shake. When our rings slid into place, a soft murmur moved through the pews, less applause than tide turning. Outside, the arch of sabers waited under enamel blue sky. 6 officers stood in perfect alignment, blades angled to catch the sun. We stepped into the tunnel of light. The last pair crossed their sabers with theatrical severity. "Toll to pass," one said, half smiling. The toll was a kiss. We paid it gladly and walked out into cheers that still felt reverent. The officers' club was polished rather than grand. Navy blue linens, brass rails buffed to a gentle glow, windows thrown open to the water where gulls skimmed like paper kites. Prime rib at the carving station steamed under a lamp. The salmon yielded in clean flakes. A 3-tier cake sat like a patient monument beside the dance floor, frosting smooth as dress whites. People who had queued in mess lines for years let themselves linger over tiny silver forks. Linda found me by a window. "For happy tears," she said, pressing a handkerchief into my palm, small anchors in 2 corners, a wreath of dogwood in one. Her stitching was careful, not perfect, and dear because of it. I folded it twice and tucked it into the pocket hidden in my skirt. Toasts rose and settled like small waves. Stories traced gentle arcs, the kind that keep their dignity. Brooks told one about the time we rewrote a training cycle and a young ensign, spared an overuse injury, later sent a thank you note with a coffee card tucked inside. Alvarez added a soft roast about my habit of lining up pens by color during long briefings. The band slid from standards to an easy waltz. Michael guided me out, his hand at my back as certain as an anchor rope. It would have been enough to let the day remain whole, but when the song ended, Brooks returned, jaw set like a man choosing his words. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I saw your father, East Gate, under the dogwood." He didn't add more. He didn't need to. I could see the tree, the low white bracts cupping light, shade pooling at the roots. I could see a man in dress greens, arms folded, back straight, standing just outside the threshold as if a chalk line on the grass had become a law, watching, then turning away. For a moment, the room thinned. Sounds separated. Glass against glass, a flag tapping its pole, the distant scrape of a chair. Michael's father waved from across the floor. Michael himself was laughing with a cousin. My thumb found the edge of Linda's stitching in my pocket and worried it like a rosary. Honor shows up where it is earned, not always where it is asked. The salute I received in that chapel belonged to the work. Years of pre-dawn PT and after-hours memos, of listening longer than speaking, of being willing to say I was wrong, and then doing the next right thing. It belonged to shipmates who gave me the gift of their trust before a crowd ever stood to its feet. Still, some small part of me had been waiting for the sound of a single pair of heels snapping to attention. We are not required to be finished with our longing just because we have been given enough. Later, when the cake had been cut and the last toast tucked itself into laughter, I stepped onto the veranda alone. Evening had cooled the railing under my hands. The bay wore a thin skin of silver. The dogwood looked moonlit, each blossom a pale coin cupped by leaves. Footprints dented the lawn near the east gate. Anyone's, I told myself, and then again, because it helped. Michael found me there, elbows on the rail, the 2 of us looking out as if the water might answer something. He didn't ask the question he could have asked. "Good day," he said at last. "A good day," I answered. The words fit. The ache didn't cancel them. It only sat beside them like a quiet guest. Inside, someone called for us. Photos before a red eye, a last hug, a promise to write. Michael squeezed my hand and went to gather people. I stayed 1 minute more, listening to the water tick against the pilings, letting the salt air clear the noise in my head. Maybe the next time we stood in the same place, he wouldn't be so far away. It arrived in a plain white envelope, the handwriting just as rigid as I remembered. The corners were sharp, the ink slightly smudged as if pressed down too hard. My name, written in block letters, looked like it had been carved rather than penned. There was no return address, but I knew who it was from the moment I saw it lying on my desk in the Pentagon's executive wing. That morning, I had delivered a keynote on ethical leadership in modern command. The auditorium had been full, the applause polite, the nods of agreement many. My words had been carefully chosen, each syllable shaped by the years I'd spent proving I belonged in the uniform I wore. I spoke of integrity, of leading by example, of earning respect when it wasn't freely given. All the while, that envelope waited on the corner of my desk like a sealed memory. When the room emptied and the lights dimmed, I returned to my office, heels clicking across polished tile. I stared at the envelope for a long time before picking it up. The paper felt heavy. I opened it without tearing, as if the act itself required reverence. Inside was a single page, no date, no greeting, just words. I wasn't at the wedding because I didn't know how to show up for something I didn't understand. I didn't know how to honor the path you chose. That's not an excuse. That's a failure. I see it now. I hope one day you might let me say that to your face. The handwriting was his, tight, slanted slightly left, uncompromising. For a moment, the air around me felt thinner. I sat down, the weight of the chair's leather unfamiliar beneath my uniform. My hands trembled slightly as I reread the lines. There was no signature, but he didn't need one. Michael found me minutes later, standing at the window overlooking the Potomac, letter still in hand. "It's from him," I said quietly. He didn't ask what it said. Instead, he rested a hand on my shoulder and said, "You should go." I nodded. There wasn't a plan. Just the growing certainty that I needed to see him, not as the girl who left for Annapolis, or the admiral who returned, but as his daughter. 3 days later, the skies over Washington had turned the color of pewter. I met him at Arlington, just beyond Section 60, where the headstones seemed to stretch in perfect formation. My mother's grave sat beneath a tree now bare of leaves, the bark damp with November rain. The wind carried the scent of earth and something faintly sweet, maybe the last of the season's fallen ginkgo. He stood waiting, hands clasped behind his back, posture still impossibly straight. He wore a gray coat, leather gloves, and a hat that shaded his eyes. When he saw me, he didn't move forward, just gave a small nod. "I read your letter," I said. He gave the faintest of smiles, one I remembered from when I was 10, and brought home a spelling bee ribbon. "I didn't know what words would be enough," he replied. They weren't, but they were honest. Silence settled between us, filled only by the rustle of leaves and the distant hum of traffic. We stood side by side facing the granite stone that bore her name. "She would have worn blue," he said after a long moment. Said it brought out her eyes. I nodded. "She called me Stormbird. Did you know that?" His lips pressed together. "No, she kept a lot just between you and her. She said I should keep flying." He let out a breath, visible in the cold. "I thought if I pushed you toward my path, you'd be safe. The Army was familiar, predictable. You were always too brave for that." "You made it sound like failure," I said, softer than I meant to. He didn't deny it. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a single photograph, one I hadn't seen. Me, standing on the deck of a ship, eyes narrowed against the wind, uniform crisp. "This sits on my desk now," he said. "I see it every morning." My throat tightened. He turned toward me fully, eyes meeting mine with something unspoken and raw. "I'm proud of you," he said simply. Even when I didn't say it, especially then. He raised his hand slowly. The salute was not sharp. It was slow, almost hesitant, the edge softened by time and regret. But it was real, a gesture not of rank but of recognition, of love, even if the word never passed his lips. I stood straighter and returned the salute, not because he outranked me, he didn't, but because he was my father. And in that moment, we stood not as soldier and admiral, but as two people finally seeing each other. The breeze carried a few golden leaves past our shoulders as we lowered our hands. My eyes burned, but I blinked them clear. I didn't cry, not there. "It didn't erase the years," I whispered, "but it opened the next one." He nodded, and for the first time, we walked away together. A year later, the room stood again. This time, so did he. It was May 2023, a soft spring morning in Washington, D.C. The Department of Defense building shimmered under the sunlight, its clean lines cutting sharp shadows on the pavement. Inside, the air carried the low hum of polite conversation, the occasional shuffle of metals brushing against uniforms. My shoes clicked softly on the polished floor as I made my way to the front, nerves quieter now than they used to be. The Excellence in Ethical Command Award wasn't something you lobbied for. It found you, usually after years of simply doing the hard, right thing when it was easier not to. I hadn't expected it, And yet, as I stood at the edge of the podium, I realized the award mattered far less than the people watching. In the second row, Michael caught my eye and gave me a steady, grounding smile. The same smile that had anchored me through deployments, reforms, and nights when silence with my father hurt more than conflict ever could. My Pentagon colleagues filled the center section, faces familiar and proud. Then, at the back, just beyond the reach of the stage lights, stood a figure straighter than I remembered, Colonel William Carter, my father. The citation was read. My name echoed in the room. I stepped forward, saluted the senior official presenting the medal, and turned toward the audience. As the rows of cadets and officers rose in unison, I saw him rise too. No hesitation, no delay. His hand moved to his brow, fingers precise but trembling ever so slightly. It wasn't the salute of an officer this time. It was something deeper. He stood not just for the admiral, but for his daughter. Applause swelled, and for the first time in my life, it didn't sound distant. I didn't have to brace myself or pretend I wasn't listening. I let the sound carry me for a moment before stepping down. Michael was waiting at the foot of the stage. His hand found mine, fingers warm and familiar, the gold of his wedding band catching the spring light. He whispered, "He did it," and I nodded without words. My father waited just beyond the aisle. People stepped aside for him, though no one had to say a word. His uniform was civilian now, a tan blazer, crisp white shirt, tie knotted a little too tight, but he still moved like the colonel I remembered. Our eyes met, and for a second, the world narrowed. He extended his hand. "Proud of you," he said, voice low, even, but thick at the edges. "Sorry it took so long." I took his hand. The grip was strong, familiar, a little colder than I expected, but not distant. "I know," I said, keeping it simple. There wasn't much else that needed to be said just then. Behind us, cameras flashed. An admiral, her father, a single handshake that held years inside it. I glanced toward the podium where the medal still hung around my neck. Its weight surprised me, but not because it was heavy, because it felt earned. Later that evening, during the quiet reception, I walked the perimeter of the hall alone. The tall windows let in the last of the golden hour light, catching the silver threads in the curtains and setting the navy blue carpet aglow. I paused near a long table of photos, past recipients, smiling dignitaries, moments of change. Someone had placed a picture of my mother among them, not labeled, not formal, just a candid photo, her in a garden hat, holding a book, half laughing at something off camera. I stood there for a moment, heart full and sore at once. I could almost hear her voice again. "Stormbird, you fly your own way, remember?" The reforms I'd championed in training policies had passed without ceremony weeks earlier. Injury rates were down, retention was up. Sailors talked about the new programs as though they'd always been there. No one mentioned my name, and I didn't mind. Some things aren't done for applause. The ceremony drew to a close. People mingled, hands were shaken, stories swapped. My father stayed near Michael, laughing lightly, asking questions. He didn't hover or hide. He belonged. When the evening ended, I stepped out into the night alone for a breath of air. The scent of magnolia hung sweet in the breeze, mixing with the distant hum of D.C. traffic. I looked up. Stars scattered above the monument skyline, quiet and sure. Some salutes are for the rank. This one was for the daughter. The spring light poured through tall windows, and this time I saw him clearly. No longer the man beneath the tree, but a father standing with me. His salute came slowly, deliberately, and it said everything the years had left unsaid. Sometimes love arrives late, wrapped not in words, but in gestures that tremble with meaning. I've learned that strength isn't only measured in rank or ribbons, but in the quiet courage to forgive and to begin again. If this story touched something in you, I invite you to share a memory, a lesson, or even a moment you once thought had passed. You might find, as I did, that some salutes are worth the wait.